He had patrolled this forest for many years and thought he knew everything about it. After the flood, he found a very old house built into a wagon, but the notes inside turned his ideas about service and duty upside down. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching from. For more than 20 years, the ranger had walked the same forest as if it were an extension of his own body. The terrain was etched into him, not through maps or coordinates, but through repetition, weight, and memory. He knew where the ground softened beneath the boots long before it turned to mud, where the trees leaned not from age, but from the slow persuasion of water beneath their roots, where birds nested higher than usual because instinct remembered what people chose to forget. This district had never been easy, never profitable, never quiet enough to earn respect among his colleagues. They called it unreliable land, a zone of recurring damage, a place that swallowed maintenance budgets and returned nothing but paperwork. To him, it was simply honest. It never pretended to be anything other than what it was. He was a man in his mid-40s, though the forest had already added a few years to his posture. His shoulders carried the dull, permanent ache of someone who had learned to lift fallen branches alone rather than wait for help. His knees remembered every winter patrol, every thaw that turned paths into traps. He had outlasted younger rangers who left for safer districts or desk work, and older ones who retired with polite speeches about service. He stayed because leaving would have meant admitting that the land was stronger than he was, and he had never accepted that conclusion easily. The flooding came every spring. It was not sudden, not dramatic in the way disasters were described in reports. It arrived gradually, patiently, as if the river were remembering something old and insisting on repeating it. Snowmelt from distant hills swelled the tributaries. Rain added its weight, and the low ground surrendered. Trails vanished first, then marker posts, then entire clearings that had seemed permanent in autumn. Each year, the ranger documented the changes with the same careful handwriting, knowing that the maps would be updated and then quietly ignored. The forest did not argue with him, and he appreciated that. This year, however, the water behaved differently. It rose higher, lingered longer, pressed into areas that had stayed dry even during the worst seasons. When it finally receded, it did not retreat politely back into its channels. It pulled things with it, rearranged the land, peeled layers away. What remained felt exposed, as if the forest had been forced to reveal something it had kept, covered out of courtesy. He noticed the change on a gray morning, when the air still carried the smell of cold water and rotting leaves. The usual route had become impassable, forcing him to circle wider than planned. It was then that he stepped onto ground that should not have existed, firm where there should have been nothing but wet silence. He slowed instinctively, scanning for fallen wires, old debris, the forgotten scars of human presence that the water liked to unbury. At first, he thought it was nothing more than driftwood arranged by chance. Lines too straight caught his attention next. The forest rarely tolerated symmetry for long. He moved closer, pushing aside low branches, and felt a subtle tightening in his chest, the kind that came not from fear, but recognition. Wood shaped by hands, not weather. Angles that resisted erosion. The suggestion of wheels half buried in silt. The structure emerged gradually, as if the land itself were reluctant to give it up. It was not a cabin in the usual sense, nor a wagon as he understood one. It was both, fused together into a single improbable object. A small house mounted on a heavy wooden carriage, its frame reinforced beyond what travel alone would require. The roof sloped low, scarred by years of debris striking it during floods. The sides bore pale lines where water had stood, retreated, and stood again. He did not approach immediately. Training told him to report it, to mark the coordinates and step back. Experience told him that once reported, the place would be reduced to an entry number and dismantled by people who would never feel what he felt standing there. He remained still, listening to the forest reassert itself around him. The wind moved through branches, water dripped somewhere unseen, and the object before him waited without urgency. When he finally stepped closer, the details confirmed what his instincts already knew. This was not a temporary shelter, abandoned in haste. It had been lived in, repaired, adjusted. The wheels were oversized, their rims reinforced with iron, worn smooth by movement through mud and shallow current. The axles bore marks of repeated stress, reinforced again and again by someone who understood that failure would come not once, but many times. This was not an escape vehicle. It was a way of life. He walked the perimeter slowly, tracing the story written into the wood. Different layers of damage spoke of different years, different floods. Some boards had been replaced entirely, newer than the rest, fitted with care rather than desperation. The roof had been patched from the inside as well as the outside, suggesting long hours spent waiting out rising water rather than fleeing from it. Whoever built this had planned to meet the flood, not outrun it. The door resisted slightly when he touched it, swollen from moisture but intact. He hesitated, hand resting on the handle, aware that crossing this threshold would move him beyond the safety of observation. There was no official permission for this moment, no checklist to follow. He thought of the radio at his belt, silent and patient. He thought of the reports he had written over the years, the language he had learned to use to make the land manageable on paper. He opened the door. The smell inside was older than neglect. It was the layered scent of wood, water, smoke long since faded, and human presence that had not been erased, but absorbed. Light filtered in through small windows set high in the walls, their placement practical rather than decorative. The space was compact, but deliberate. Nothing here had been accidental. He stepped inside carefully, aware of the way the floor responded beneath his weight. It was reinforced, built to hold not just furniture, but motion. Shelves lined the walls, secured with wooden brackets that had been replaced at least once. There was a small cooking area, blackened but orderly, and storage compartments built into every available surface. This was not the interior of a wagon hurriedly converted. It was the interior of a home designed to move. What unsettled him most was the evidence of children. On one wall, faint but unmistakable, were marks scratched into the wood at irregular intervals, heights recorded not with dates, but with memory. The lowest marks were nearly worn away, the higher ones clearer, stopping abruptly before adulthood. He stood there longer than necessary, imagining small hands reaching up, standing straighter with each passing year, measuring growth against a wall that itself was never still. He moved deeper inside, noting how everything had been secured against shifting weight and water pressure. Hinges were reinforced, latches were doubled. Even the smallest items had designated places, suggesting long familiarity with chaos. This family had learned, over time, what the river would take if given the chance. Near the rear of the structure, he noticed a section of flooring that felt different beneath his boot, slightly raised, more solid. He knelt, examining the seams, and found them too precise to be structural necessity. Someone had hidden something here with the expectation that it might need to remain hidden for a long time. He did not open it yet. Instead, he sat back on his heels, the weight of the discovery settling over him slowly. This was not merely an abandoned artifact. It was a decision preserved in wood and iron, a refusal to leave, a method of staying that did not involve winning. Outside, the forest continued as it always had. Inside, time waited. He closed the door gently behind him when he stepped out, leaving the interior unchanged. He marked nothing, recorded nothing. For the first time in his career, he chose silence over procedure. The river would rise again soon enough. He knew that. And when it did, whatever this place represented would either be taken back into the moving water or demand something from him that he was not yet ready to name. He stood there until the light shifted and the air grew colder, the presence of the house on wheels settling into his awareness as something that would not let him go easily. The land had revealed a fragment of itself, and he understood, with a quiet certainty, that it was only the beginning. He returned the next morning before the fog had fully lifted from the low ground. The night had not brought rest. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by the quiet persistence of images that refused to settle into memory and fade. The house on wheels followed him into his dreams, not as a curiosity, but as a presence, something that had been waiting a long time and had finally been acknowledged. When he woke, there was no sense of decision, only inevitability. He dressed, checked his equipment out of habit rather than necessity, and took a route that avoided the main trails. If anyone noticed the deviation later, it could be explained. For now, he needed the forest undisturbed. The ground was still damp, carrying the soft suction of retreating water. The air smelled cleaner than the day before, as if the land itself had exhaled. When the structure came into view again, it no longer felt like a sudden discovery. It stood where it had stood before, heavy and patient, no longer startling, but no less strange. In daylight, its construction revealed itself more clearly, and with it, the intent of those who had built it. He circled it slowly, this time with a more deliberate eye. The wheels were not identical, a detail that struck him immediately. Two had been replaced at some point, their wood darker, their iron bands forged differently. They bore the marks of later years, of tools improved by time, rather than scarcity. The remaining wheels were older, their spokes worn thinner, the grain of the wood smoothed by water and motion. This house had not been built all at once. It had grown into itself. The undercarriage was reinforced in ways that went beyond the demands of travel. Thick beams ran the length of the structure, braced against twisting forces that could only come from moving water. Metal plates had been bolted where joints might fail under pressure, their edges rounded and scarred by debris carried in floods. Whoever designed this had learned by experience, not theory. The river had been a teacher, and its lessons had been expensive. He crouched near the base and traced the pale lines along the sides with his fingers. Each line marked a season when the water had risen high enough to leave its signature. They were not evenly spaced. Some years had been worse than others, and the house recorded them faithfully. In places, the wood bore faint carvings beside the marks, barely visible now. He leaned closer and realized they were not measurements, but symbols, small notches made deliberately. Not warnings, not pleas, but acknowledgments. The family had counted the floods not as threats, but as events worth remembering. The roof drew his attention next. It sloped gently, not for snow, but for flow. Its edges were reinforced with additional layers that had clearly been added after early damage. Branches, he guessed, and perhaps worse, had once slammed into it when the house had been caught in moving water. Instead of abandoning the design, the builders had adapted it. The patches told a story of refusal, of improvement rather than retreat. He opened the door again, more confidently this time, and stepped inside with the sense of entering a space that had once known routine. The light fell differently in the morning, illuminating details he had missed before. The shelves were worn smooth, where hands had reached for the same objects again and again. Hinges creaked softly but held firm. The floor bore the subtle indentations of long use, not the collapse of neglect. He moved through the space slowly, allowing himself to imagine it alive. A kettle heating while water pressed against the walls outside. Children sitting on the floor during the worst moments, told to stay low, to listen. The furniture was arranged not for comfort, but for balance. Nothing here could shift suddenly without consequence. Every object had been placed with the assumption that the world outside might move violently at any moment. At the rear of the house, he noticed a set of iron rings bolted into the frame. They were heavy, reinforced, and showed signs of stress. Rope fibers clung to them in places, long since rotted but still present. He understood immediately. When the floods came, the house had not always been free to move. Sometimes it had been anchored, tied to the strongest trees available, allowed to rise and strain but not drift away. The image settled heavily in his mind. A house pulled taut against the force of water, holding its ground, not by resisting movement, but by choosing where that movement would end. He stepped back outside and looked around at the surrounding trees. Several bore scars at their bases, old rope burns smoothed by time. These marks were easy to miss unless one knew what to look for. The forest had grown around them, absorbed them into its own memory. He wondered how many times he had passed this area before without seeing what it had been prepared to show him now. Returning inside, he focused again on the interior. The marks on the wall drew him back. He traced them with his eyes, imagining the passage of years. The last mark was lower than he expected. The child who had grown here had not reached adulthood within these walls. Whether that meant they left or something else, he could not yet know. The thought lingered, unanswered, like a question the house was not ready to answer. He knelt again at the section of flooring he had noticed the day before. This time, he did not hesitate. The panel lifted with surprising ease, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Inside lay a wooden box, its surface darkened by age but intact. It had been wrapped once in cloth, now brittle and nearly dissolved. He lifted it carefully, aware of the weight of what he was doing. This was no longer an inspection. It was an intrusion. He set the box on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were notebooks, their covers warped but legible, and a bundle of letters tied with a strip of faded fabric. There were also small objects, a child's carved figure, a metal button, a fragment of a broken tool. Items kept not for utility but for memory. He did not read yet. Instead, he closed the box again and sat quietly, listening to the sounds of the forest filtering in through the walls. The realization came gradually, settling into him with a clarity that felt almost unwelcome. This house had not been abandoned because it failed. It had been left because its purpose had ended. Whether through choice or necessity, the life it supported had moved on. The structure remained not as a ruin, but as a record, left where it could be found only by someone willing to see beyond the surface of the land. He thought again of the radio at his belt, of the reports waiting to be written. He imagined the house dismantled, its components catalogued, its story reduced to a brief summary in an archive few would read. The thought felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with rules. This place had endured not because it was hidden, but because it had been allowed to exist on its own terms. As he replaced the box beneath the floor, he made a careful mental note of every detail, every repair, every mark left by water and hands. If he was going to carry this knowledge, he would do so fully. He closed the panel and stood, the weight of the decision not yet formed, but already present. Outside, the river murmured quietly, reduced now to a manageable presence. He knew it would not stay that way. It never did. And as he walked away, leaving the house once more in its uneasy truce with the land, he understood that the next step would require more than observation. The structure had revealed its purpose. What remained was to listen to the voices it had been built to protect, waiting patiently beneath the floor, bound in paper and time. He did not read the journals all at once. The decision to open the box again came only after he had returned to his cabin that evening and found himself unable to perform even the smallest habitual tasks without thinking of what waited beneath the floor of the house on wheels. He cooked and ate without tasting, washed his hands twice without remembering why, and sat for a long time with the radio turned off, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. It was not curiosity that pulled him back the following afternoon, but a sense of obligation he could not name. The structure had shown him how it had been built. Now it demanded to be heard. When he lifted the panel and brought the box into the light again, he did so with a carefulness that bordered on reverence. The notebooks were arranged by size rather than date, an odd choice, until he realized that paper availability must have dictated the order as much as chronology. The earliest was the smallest, its cover nearly detached, its pages thin and stained at the edges. He opened it gently, the paper whispering under his fingers like dry leaves. The handwriting was firm but unadorned, the letters formed with the economy of someone who wrote often, but never for display. The first entries were not dramatic. They spoke of water levels, of repairs made and repairs planned, of weather patterns observed over weeks and months. There was no sense of alarm in the words, no mention of disaster. Flooding was treated as a condition, not a calamity. It was listed alongside other facts of life, like the direction of the wind or the behavior of animals before rain. As he read further, the voice of the writer began to emerge more clearly. This was someone who had learned patience through necessity, who measured time not in dates, but in seasons and cycles. The river was referred to not as an enemy, but as a force that demanded respect and accommodation. The idea of the house on wheels appeared gradually, not as a sudden inspiration, but as the result of many small adjustments. First came raised flooring, then reinforced walls. Finally, the decision that staying in one place might be less safe than learning how to move without leaving. The ranger felt a subtle shift within himself as he absorbed these pages. He had spent years thinking of adaptation as something the forest required of him professionally, a matter of policy and management. Here, adaptation was intimate. It was personal. It was the difference between erasure and continuation. Later, notebooks introduced other hands. The writing grew smaller, more rounded in places, suggesting contributions from more than one person. There were entries about children learning to read by lantern light while water pressed against the walls, about games invented to distract them during long nights of rain. The tone never turned bitter. There was fatigue, certainly, and moments of doubt, but always an underlying insistence that this life, difficult as it was, belonged to them. One entry, written in a steadier hand than the others, described the first time the house had been tied to the trees during a major flood. The writer noted the fear in the children's faces, the sound of the ropes straining, the way the entire structure had risen slightly and then held. The relief that followed was described not with celebration, but with quiet acknowledgement. It had worked. That was enough. As the ranger turned page after page, the family's world expanded beyond the immediate struggle with water. There were descriptions of routes taken when the house moved, of favored patches of higher ground used during dry seasons. The writers spoke of places not marked on any map, of landmarks known only to them. They described the forest as a living thing with moods and habits, something to be learned rather than conquered. He recognized that perspective. It mirrored his own in ways that unsettled him. The tone of the journals shifted as the years progressed. References appeared to officials visiting the area, to notices posted on trees, and nailed to makeshift boards. The land was being reclassified, deemed unsafe, unsuitable for settlement. The language quoted in the journals was formal and distant, full of assurances that assistance would be provided elsewhere. The writers responded to this with restraint rather than anger. They noted the visits, recorded the words used, and continued with their preparations. One entry stood out, written with a pressure that darkened the page. It described a meeting in which the family was told that remaining on the land would no longer be tolerated. The river, the officials said, made the area too dangerous. The risk was unacceptable. The solution offered was relocation. The writer recorded the moment carefully, noting not just the words spoken, but the expressions on the faces of those who spoke them. There was no malice there, only certainty. The kind of certainty that leaves no room for discussion. After that entry, the journals grew quieter. There were still notes about repairs and weather, but something else had entered the narrative. A plan, unspoken at first, then gradually articulated. If the system required their absence, they would provide it, not by leaving, but by disappearing. The ranger felt a tightening in his chest as he read the pages that followed. The family documented the steps they took to remove themselves from official awareness. They stopped accepting supplies. They avoided contact. They learned the rhythms of patrols and inspections, choosing their movements carefully. The house on wheels, once a solution to flooding, became a means of invisibility. One letter, folded carefully and placed among the journals, explained the decision with painful clarity. It was written to no one in particular, perhaps intended as a record rather than correspondence. The writer acknowledged the danger of the choice, the loneliness it would bring. But there was also a quiet defiance in the words, a refusal to allow safety to be defined solely by those who would never live with the consequences of their definitions. The final entries in the largest notebook were brief. Dates became less precise. References to the outside world diminished. Then, abruptly, the writing stopped. There was no conclusion, no explanation. The silence felt deliberate, as if the family had reached a point where recording their lives was no longer necessary or no longer safe. The ranger closed the notebook and sat back, the weight of the story pressing against him. He thought of the old case he had encountered early in his career, the one that had troubled him, without his ever quite knowing why. A family presumed lost in a flood. No bodies recovered. The incident quietly filed away as an unfortunate but inevitable outcome of living in a dangerous area. The surname in the journal matched the name on that report. The realization was slow but undeniable. The official record was wrong. Not incomplete, not misleading, but wrong. The family had not died. They had chosen a different form of survival, one that left no trace the system could recognize. The house on wheels was not a relic of failure. It was evidence of a successful escape. He felt the boundary between past and present blur as he considered the implications. The policies he enforced today were built on the same assumptions that had driven that family into invisibility. He had written warnings himself, signed off on closures, believed in the necessity of removing people from places deemed unsafe. Reading these journals, he could no longer claim innocence. He saw now how easily protection could become erasure. As dusk settled outside, the light within the house shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. He returned the journals to the box one by one, his hand steady despite the turmoil in his thoughts. When the panel was closed again, it felt less like hiding something and more like preserving it. He remained inside the house for a long time afterward, sitting where the family must have sat, listening to the forest. The structure creaked softly as the temperature changed, responding like a living thing. He wondered how many nights they had spent here, reading by low light, listening for the sound of water rising. He wondered what had finally led them to leave, or whether they ever truly had. When he stepped outside, the air had cooled, and the river reflected the fading sky in muted tones. He knew that the knowledge he carried now could not be unlearned. The voices from the journals had crossed a century to reach him, and with them came a responsibility he had never sought. The next steps would not be simple. The past had found a way to speak, and it had done so through him. The knowledge he carried back with him that evening did not remain contained within the neat boundaries of thought. It followed him into every movement, every pause, every automatic gesture shaped by years of routine. When he locked the storage shed, when he logged the day's patrol in the system with deliberately vague phrasing, when he poured water into the kettle and waited for it to heat, the voices from the journals seemed to settle beside him, not accusing, not demanding, simply present. They had crossed time without urgency. They did not need him to hurry. But they did not allow him to pretend ignorance either. He began to notice the present more sharply, as if the past had sharpened his vision. Notices posted at trailheads about restricted zones now carried a different weight. The language felt familiar in an uncomfortable way, echoing phrases he had read in the journals, softened by decades, but unchanged in intent. Safety, liability, necessary measures. Words designed to close conversations rather than open them. He had used them himself, had believed in them as tools of order. Now he saw how easily they could become instruments of disappearance. During a routine briefing later that week, his supervisor mentioned upcoming inspections in flood-prone districts. There was nothing unusual in the announcement, nothing that would have raised concern before. Yet he felt his attention narrow, his body reacting before his mind caught up. The timing was wrong, the water had not fully receded, and inspections meant exposure. Exposure meant documentation. Documentation meant the end of silence. He answered questions when addressed, nodded at appropriate moments, and kept his expression neutral. Years of service had taught him how to look attentive without revealing thought. Still, he felt as though the structure in the forest were listening through him, waiting to see which version of him would speak when it mattered. That night, he returned to the journals again, not to read from the beginning, but to sit with the final pages. The absence of a conclusion disturbed him more than any written tragedy could have. It suggested choice rather than failure, agency rather than accident. The family had stopped recording not because they had nothing left to say, but because they no longer needed to leave evidence. They had stepped fully outside the system that demanded explanation. He wondered what it had cost them. Isolation, certainly. Fear, perhaps, though the journals did not dwell on it. He wondered whether they had been discovered later, whether the silence marked freedom or simply another transition. The uncertainty pressed against him, unresolved, mirroring his own situation. He, too, stood at a threshold where no instruction manual existed. The following days brought subtle pressure. A colleague asked casually why his reports from the flooded area lacked the usual level of detail. Another mentioned rumors of unusual debris uncovered by the water. None of it was overt, but the questions accumulated, forming a quiet net. He answered carefully, drawing on years of experience to remain technically accurate while revealing nothing essential. It was a skill he had rarely needed before. Using it now felt like crossing a line he had once sworn he would never approach. Each visit to the house on wheels reinforced the weight of his position. He did not linger as long as he once had, aware that familiarity could breed mistakes. He checked the ropes, the anchors, the surrounding trees, not to secure the house, but to understand how easily it might vanish again beneath rising water. The structure had survived because it moved with the river rather than defying it. He began to see his own dilemma reflected in that design. On one visit, he noticed fresh footprints nearby. They were not recent, softened by time and moisture, but they weren't his. Someone else had passed close, Perhaps another ranger? Perhaps a hiker who had wandered off the marked paths. The realization tightened something in his chest. The window for solitary decision-making was closing. That night, he sat at his desk with the official reporting template open on his computer. The cursor blinked patiently, waiting. He knew what the system expected. Coordinates, description, assessment, recommendation. He also knew how easily the truth could be flattened into language that stripped it of meaning, a structure of historical interest, evidence of early settlement, subject to removal and preservation. The words formed readily, shaped by years of training. He did not type them. Instead, he considered the family's final choice, the way they had engineered their lives around the inevitability of water rather than the illusion of control. They had accepted risk without surrendering dignity. He asked himself what dignity meant in his own context. Was it obedience to procedure or fidelity to something less defined but more enduring? The answer did not arrive as a revelation. It emerged slowly, through exhaustion, through the recognition that neutrality was no longer an option. To report fully would be to erase the very story he had been entrusted to hear. To remain silent entirely would invite suspicion and eventual discovery. The path forward, like the house on wheels, would require movement without visibility. He began to write, choosing his words with deliberate care. He documented flood damage consistent with prior years. He noted altered terrain and unstable ground. He recommended temporary access restrictions due to safety concerns. He omitted coordinates. He described debris in general terms, nothing that would invite curiosity. The report was accurate in everything it said, and profoundly misleading in everything it left unsaid. When he finished, he sat back and read it again, testing it against his conscience. It held. The structure would remain undocumented, unclaimed by the archive. The journals would stay beneath the floor, protected not by secrecy alone, but by indifference. The system would see what it expected to see and move on. The final act came later, quietly. He removed the journals from the box and took them home, not all at once, but over several visits, ensuring that no single absence would be noticed. He wrapped them carefully and stored them where humidity and light would not reach. He did not tell himself he was preserving them for future revelation. He told himself only that they deserved to exist without scrutiny. As the season shifted and the first signs of renewed rain appeared, he returned to the site one last time before the water rose again. He stood beside the house, resting his hand against its weathered side. He felt no triumph, no sense of victory, only a quiet alignment, as if he had adjusted himself slightly to match the rhythm of the land. When the rains came and the river began to swell once more, he watched from a distance. The water climbed steadily, reclaiming the low ground. The house did not resist. It rose as it had been designed to rise, straining gently against its anchors, then settling into motion as the ropes were released by the force of the current. Within days, it was no longer visible, absorbed back into the moving water and the forest's long memory. He returned to his duties as before. He answered questions, filed reports, walked the trails. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, the line he had crossed remained, indelible. He was no longer merely a servant of policy. He had become, by choice rather than title, a keeper of something fragile and unrecorded. The forest accepted this without comment, as it accepted all things that learned to move with it rather than against it. The water returned the way it always did, without announcement and without regard for what had been decided in its absence. It began with a subtle change in sound, the low murmur of the river thickening, growing heavier at night. Then came the smell, sharp and unmistakable, carried on the wind before the first visible signs appeared. By the time the bank softened and the low ground darkened, the ranger had already adjusted his patrols, not out of habit now, but out of awareness. He knew exactly where the water would go and what it would take with it. From a distance, he watched the forest accept the rising river as it had for centuries. There was no violence in the movement, no sudden destruction. The water crept and spread, filling hollows, lifting debris, reshaping the land with patient inevitability. The place where the house on wheels had stood disappeared. First beneath a thin reflective sheet, then beneath rippling depth. He did not approach. There was nothing more to do there. The structure had been designed for this moment, and he trusted it more than he trusted any barrier humans might erect. In the following weeks, questions surfaced and faded, as they always did. Reports circulated about increased flooding, about sections of land that would need to remain closed indefinitely. His earlier documentation proved sufficient, unremarkable, unchallenged. No one asked him to clarify what he had not said. The system, satisfied by its own language, moved on. He returned to the rhythm of his work, but it was no longer the same rhythm he had known before. Each step through the forest carried a different weight, informed by an understanding that went beyond policy. He noticed things he had once overlooked, small adaptations made by animals and plants in response to water, to change, to pressure. The land wasn't static. It never had been. The illusion of permanence had belonged only to those who did not live long enough in one place to see its cycles complete. At home, the journals rested in their carefully chosen place, untouched. He did not reread them. He did not feel the need. Their presence alone was enough, a quiet confirmation that the past had not been entirely erased. They existed without witnesses, without interpretation, exactly as their writers might have intended. He thought sometimes of the family, of the children whose growth had been marked on the walls of a moving house. He wondered where their descendants might be, whether the choices made a century earlier had rippled outward into lives unrecognizable, yet shaped by the same refusal to disappear. As summer advanced, the water receded once more, leaving behind altered ground and new silences. The place where the house had stood emerged again, but it was not the same. The river had shifted slightly, its channels redrawn. There was no sign of the structure, no trace that would draw an untrained eye. He felt a brief tightening in his chest at the thought that it might be gone forever, then released it. Loss had never been the opposite of meaning. Sometimes it was the condition that allowed meaning to exist without interference. He did not seek the house again. The decision surprised him at first, then settled into certainty. To look for it would be to impose himself on something that had already completed its cycle. The forest did not preserve things for retrieval. It held them until they no longer needed to be held. Months passed. The inspections came and went. New directives replaced old ones. The language remained familiar, endlessly rearranged, but fundamentally unchanged. He continued to serve within it, not as a rebel or a hero, but as someone who had learned where the limits of service lay. He followed the rules where they protected life. He bent them where they threatened to erase it. On a late autumn afternoon, he found himself standing at the edge of the flooded zone once more, the water now calm and low, reflecting a pale sky. The forest around him was quiet, resting between seasons. He thought of the house on wheels, of the ingenuity it represented, the quiet defiance of its design. It had not been built to be remembered. It had been built to endure. That, he realized, was the difference. He understood now that what remained was not the structure itself, nor even the journals he had preserved. What remained was a shift in how he saw his role, and by extension, how he saw the land. He was no longer simply a guardian of boundaries drawn by others. He was a witness to histories that did not seek recognition, a participant in a continuity that did not require approval. As he turned back toward the trail, He felt no need to look behind him. The forest did not demand acknowledgement. It accepted his presence as it accepted all things that learned its rhythms. The water would rise again. It always would. And somewhere, whether visible or not, the memory of a house that moved with the river would continue to exist, not as an artifact, but as an understanding carried quietly forward by the one person who had been willing to listen. The chapter and the story ended not with revelation, but with preservation. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. More stories are already waiting, and new ones are coming soon. Share this video with someone who values quiet truths and forgotten histories.